today we're going to be talking about kind of addiction and how it impacts society, and kind of looking at how that the interplay between incarceration plays a big role of that in that. And in the Vanderbilt Center for Addiction Research, this is kind of the stuff that we study all the time from the basic science level. So I'm really excited to kind of have this conversation with everybody today, coming from all of these unique perspectives. So I'll introduce myself first. I'm Erin Calipari. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Pharmacology at Vanderbilt University. I'm a member of the Vanderbilt Center for Addiction Research. My work focuses on understanding decision-making, how this is regulated by drugs of abuse. But one of the things I'm excited to talk about today with the group is kind of how this differentially impacts women. And so a lot of my work focuses on sex differences in drug responses and outcomes, and kind of how we should be thinking about treating this disease differentially in men and women.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. I'm Danny Winder. I direct the Vanderbilt Center for Addiction Research, and we've really got three main goals in this center. One is to obtain a deep understanding of the molecular mechanisms that change in the brain and association with addiction, and to try to leverage those into actual therapeutic benefit. And then we're really interested in discussing this with the public, especially from the perspective of destigmatization around talking about the problem of addiction. We think this is really important for a number of reasons. And my particular research is focused heavily around the intersection of stress and addiction, and so really interested in the impact of incarceration and the impact of the war on drugs on what has happened to treating addiction in our society.
Thanks. I'm Katrina Frierson, founding CEO of Mending Hearts, which is a nonprofit here locally, landed our feet in groundwork here in Nashville, Tennessee. First and foremost, I want to thank all of you, Erin. You guys are just, Danny, you guys are just phenomenal. And Tarra, thank you so graciously for doing the work and paving the way for us. And Piper, hats off, man. You rock. I thank you for fighting the way, showing us the way and the actuality of what's really real for women. And so that brings me to, wow, we're here and making this movement, national movement of women touched by addiction, and how it affects us across the board. And so I'm just so hopeful that this information that we dialogue on here today will just give not only us more insight, but our community at large. And so I'm just so excited.
Hi, I'm Piper Kerman, and I am a formerly incarcerated woman. I was incarcerated for a drug offense from 2004 to 2005, and I wrote a book about that experience, which is called Orange is the New Black. And that was adapted into a Netflix series. And a fundamental part of my own lived experience, and also a fundamental part of so many of the narratives of the book and of the show, relate to drug policy and its impact on women and its impact on families. I'm very fortunate that I have not suffered from substance use disorder, but like most people in this country, I have loved ones, I have family members who do struggle with addiction and with substance use disorder. And so I have seen that up close and personal, in addition to my experiences in prison and since leaving prison, in advocating for a complete transformation in the way that we think about women specifically in the criminal justice system and changing drug policy in this country.
Thank you all. And my name is Tarra Simmons, and I am a formerly incarcerated mother of two sons. I am a woman in long-term recovery from substance use disorder. I've been out of prison for 8 years now. Prior to my incarceration, I came from generations where every single person in my family has suffered with substance use disorder and has been incarcerated. And I've been out 8 years now, but prior to that, I was a registered nurse. And today I am an attorney and I am also a state representative in Washington. And we just actually finished a huge drug policy this last session, and I'm excited to share with you our move to decriminalize substance use disorder and drug possession, and to provide a more therapeutic and humane approach to this issue.
Well, we really appreciate you, both of you, being here with us today and getting a chance to talk about this. So I would love to hear your thoughts on what you view as sort of the intersection of addiction and incarceration, and how those two impact reentry after incarceration.
Yeah, maybe Tarra, you could answer that, because it sounds like it's right up your alley and kind of how you're thinking about creating legislation to really address that specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when I was released from prison 8 years ago, I was released, with drug charges on my record and an active RN license, but nobody would give me a job because of my criminal history. And so really I went to law school and started this career in law and politics because of my friends in recovery. I went to recovery meetings for the first time in my life and found out that I wasn't alone, and there were so many other people struggling with these systemic barriers in relation to housing and employment and paying off your court fines and fees and trying to get your children back and just trying to provide for your family after, having a criminal record. So, when we criminalize substance use disorder and mental health challenges and things like that, then our drug policies have really led to this system where then it is almost impossible, after you do the work and you find a healthy life and a support system for decades afterwards, it's still very hard to get out of poverty. And so all of these policies really affect people, especially women, when you're trying to, reunify with your children and provide for them. And that's what really led to my career. And so the stigma of the criminal record related to a health condition is really what I'm trying to change.
Yeah, so
I would also put that in a broad context. When we look at women and girls specifically who have criminal system contact and possibly incarceration, we see overwhelmingly that the vast majority of them have substance use disorder or mental health challenges, and often both. And the vast majority of them are incarcerated for a drug offense or for a property crime, which is often driven by addiction. So when we look at the incarceration of women, which has been the fastest growing group of people in the prison system over decades in this country, what overwhelmingly drives the incarceration of women is issues related to addiction and substance use disorder. And we also see staggering rates of trauma. And I don't think that's not a coincidence. So trauma intersects with substance use disorder, which rolls right into incarceration. And the irony is that incarceration in this country, prisons and jails, are profoundly punitive. So what unequivocally happens to women who have been incarcerated for whatever reason, but including for reasons that are directly tethered into trauma, is that we continue that trauma in ways that are profound and very difficult to recover from. So thinking about the recovery that we expect from people who struggle with substance use disorder and addiction, there's nothing about the American criminal legal system which is designed to effectively address that trauma. And it's my opinion that it's impossible to address those kinds of traumas that, most women who struggle with addiction have experienced in a coercive setting and in a punitive setting. So the idea that the criminal legal system is ever going to address our problems with addiction in this country is, I can't really say it's a joke, because it's a real cruelty.
This is actually, I'm so happy you brought this up. I think this is something that's so important. So one of the things my lab studies is kind of fundamental drivers of behavior. And so what, on a basic kind of level, what you're looking at is a punishment. And what we know about basic biology is that punishers like incarceration or even punishing children, they don't change behavior, they suppress it. And so as soon as you remove the punisher, you let people back out into the world, that behavior comes right back because you didn't actually change the motivation, the root cause, the trauma. And so, this goes all the way down to kind of rodents and lower order organisms. And this is just a fundamental kind of thing that we know about behavior. And so it is kind of amazing as addiction researchers to watch how the policies don't address the things that we know are behavioral drivers. And so I guess when I think about it, and this is why I'm excited about you guys, is to kind of solve this problem, you need research to understand it, which is where the Addiction Center comes in. You need policies to change so that you can actually empower women. You need to give them support and kind of a place to live, a way to get back into society, which is what Katrina and Mending Hearts do. And then we need to have a conversation that's relatable to people so they understand why it's so important, which Piper, why we have shows like Orange is the New Black is such a kind of paradigm shifting thing for society, because it's entertainment, but people are relating to the characters in a way that they maybe didn't to the kind of public. So I'm like fangirling right now. I'm so excited to have you guys all on here, because these are the kind of things that are going to change how the world works for women. And I'm just like, I don't know, Trina, how are you guys? I mean, you guys are doing such great things too, to approach this problem from kind of a different angle than Tarra and Piper.
Yeah. I think one of the best things that happened to me personally, being in long-term recovery, but in the beginning, I think one of the best things that happened to me, and the reason I'm here today in recovery, I don't think I would have been here this long if someone hadn't picked me up at the gate. The beauty of the process that I was in is that I did a long-term treatment program while incarcerated. I got some of those services met. Oftentimes, I believe that, we have these pop-up services in the institution, but we don't have any follow-up care. We don't have any wraparound care. And I think the best thing that happened for me in my time is that I was not only released, but I was released in the care of. Someone picked me up at the gate at Roll Up One. I didn't get to go back to the bus stop with my knitted bag. And they took me to a transitional halfway house. Now, I didn't get everything I needed in there, but it was the women that was in that house that wrapped around me, that supported me until I could get the support I needed. But even after that, I went to a two-year aftercare program that gave me therapy, that gave me family therapy, that gave my kids that were broken and I lost all parental rights. They even gave them individual therapy, because I believe that, like, not only do we recover, we have to recover with those broken relationships and try to rekindle those as well. And so with Mending Hearts, my goal is that not only that we assess the woman while she's incarcerated, but let's meet her at the door. Let's welcome her with open arms, and let's bring her into service with the intentions of knowing her discharge before she discharges, with those wraparound services. And so, each woman is different. We cannot treat every individual the same. And so I'm grateful for the process. This right here is blowing my mind. It's like, today is Friday and it's a great day for me. It's June 18th, my firstborn birthday today. And then I just had a baby, my first biological grandbaby, over an hour and a half ago. And now I get to sit on a team of so many wonderful people, like really addressing real life problems, because I'm not one to sit on a committee and just sing a lot of songs and the song don't get produced. And so I feel like that this group is really meaningful. And so I'm one of those girls from the hood, and I like to see action moving. And so, I'm excited about this thing. I believe that there's so much coming from this, that we're on to something. And when we're talking about women and women touched by addiction, this national movement, you guys, we have the right team here. So I'm excited about what's about to happen.
Trina, you mentioned dates, and I think another date that bears mentioning is we're recording this just shortly after the 50th anniversary of the announcement of the war on drugs, right? And
Yes.
I think that, I'm curious to hear the thoughts from Tarra and Piper on sort of how far we've come from that and where we can continue to go.
Yes.
Yeah, I would also like to point out that tomorrow is Juneteenth, and here in Washington State, we passed a bill this session to make that a holiday. And, in my mind, when I think about the war on drugs, I really think about racism and how it was intentionally done to really control the Black members of our state and our communities, and continue to create a system of free labor and feed into the prison industrial complex. And so we can't, lose sight of that either. And that, Black women face even additional barriers to recovery and so many other complex issues. But, we are making some progress, I will say, on all of these intersecting issues. Here in Washington, for example, our state Supreme Court on February 25th of this year struck down our felony drug possession statute and said that it was unconstitutional because it was a strict liability crime. And so in the legislature, we had an opportunity, an opening to look at decriminalizing drug possession, which in itself, drug possession is not causing harm to anybody else. It is, indica of substance use disorder. And so we did end up passing a bill. It's only in effect for 2 years. We took our drug possession statute from a felony, which carries up to 5 years in prison, down to a misdemeanor, which carries up to 90 days in jail. But before a person can even be charged with that misdemeanor, they have to have 2 diversions from law enforcement to a navigator and attempted to get into services. And so we're really bringing our services and connection and help upstream even further. But you can see across America, we have, created drug courts and other kinds of alternatives. And so progress is really slow. 50 years of suffering and, harming a vulnerable population who really are traumatized people, and we've been traumatizing them more. 50 years is a very long time. And it's frustrating for me in my position now as a legislator, because I want the change to happen much more quickly, but not everybody agrees. And so that's why we still had to have this misdemeanor on the books for the next 2 years, and then it will sunset. And hopefully we are going to get to full decriminalization in Washington State. And right now, one thing I am happy about is that we invested $85 million in substance use disorder in Washington, and we're building the infrastructure to create the alternative. And no longer will people have to be jailed and arrested and strip searched and incarcerated in order to get help. And so we are making progress, but it is slow. And, other places across the country haven't even come this far yet. So there's still lots of work to do.
So, I have a kind of question about Orange is the New Black and kind of this book and this show, and kind of, it was huge. I've seen all of it. I love it. And I need to go back and read the book. I've been reading more lately. But I guess, how do you think, Piper, that stories like this and kind of using storytelling to kind of really reach kind of down into people's hearts, how do you think that can influence policy? And when you're kind of putting pen to paper, were you just kind of writing your story, or were you thinking, how can I write this in a way that kind of really resonates with people to make a difference? I guess, how do you kind of approach that and think about that?
When I chose to write about my own experience of incarceration, I absolutely thought about wanting to have a transformative effect on the reader. I wanted them to come away with a different idea about who we put in prison, because people don't necessarily think of women and girls first. I wanted them to think differently and know more about why we incarcerate so many of our own people. In the case of women and girls, substance use disorder, addiction, drugs, alcohol play a huge role in our choice to punish. And what really happened to people behind the wire, behind the wall, in terms of putting women and girls into this incredibly punitive setting, relentlessly punitive setting. So that was what I wanted. That was the intention of my writing, is to have that transformative effect on the reader. And I was really grateful that, I was able to partner with people creatively who had that same vision. And, it's a big leap of faith to entrust a story, which is really important to you, to other people. But what I would say, I have been to 49 states in this country, and almost all of them to talk to people about these issues. And people come to these questions with a huge amount of lived experience. Addiction and substance use disorder touch so many people, so many families, that people have a wealth of lived experience with addiction and often with incarceration that's driven by addiction. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone sheds their ideas about punishment when it comes to addiction. That's really very hard for many people to relinquish. But those dialogues are incredibly important, and you need stories in order to get to dialogues, right? That's sort of one of the most important parts that story and narrative plays when it comes to changing these policies, and also the broader attitude. I mean, we have to change the policies, but the policies can't change until we change people's attitudes and ideas about addiction, and most importantly, about people who suffer from addiction. So I think that we have so far to go when it comes to the recognition of addiction as a disease, right? Yes. As opposed to a quote unquote choice. Well, so there's another.
Sorry, I was thinking about attitudes too. I think, as a writer, how language and how you say things alters people's perception. And so, one of the big pushes recently is to, kind of, instead of calling people addicts, to say individuals suffering from substance use disorder, and to start to change the way we speak about these individuals so that it's not that they are the addiction, which obviously you guys are shining examples of the fact that, being in trouble for drugs or suffering from addiction doesn't mean that that's the only thing you are. And so I think it's kind of another thing to think about too, how language shapes how we view these individuals, and these individuals aren't just that problem.
Yeah. I mean, I think when we think about, Tarra and I ask people not to call incarcerated people inmates or convicts or other labeling words, which reduce people to a small aspect of really who they are as a whole. And if we think about sort of the compounding factor of suffering from addiction and perhaps having experienced incarceration and how those things snowball, and if we think about how that impacts the way that people think about themselves and their own stories, one of the most fascinating things that I've learned in recent years is about the role of narrative in desistance. So I taught, writing in a men's medium security prison and the largest women's prison in Ohio for more than 4 years. And during the course, and people were writing narrative nonfiction, personal nonfiction, their own stories, whatever stories they wanted to tell. During the time that I was doing that, a person said, "Oh, have you seen some of this desistance research? Because it has a lot to do with what you're doing." And I was like, "No." So we think so much about recidivism when we talk about the criminal legal system, but what we really need to think about, and what I imagine is very familiar to addiction researchers, is the question of desistance. What allows a person to stop doing something that either harms themselves or harms other people? It could be substance use. It could also be violence. It could be any number of things. But the research is interesting because it shows that narrative plays a big part. In other words, the stories that people tell themselves about themselves, the stories that other people have told them about themselves, need to be transformed. And that needs to be a really conscious process. And when people have the opportunity to work on changing the narrative, changing the way that they think about themselves, changing the way they think about their past. That doesn't mean avoiding their past. It means addressing your past, contending with it, but then also thinking about your future and starting to write a narrative for your future, which is different than your past or your present, is incredibly important for people to be able to desist doing whatever it is that's harming themselves or others and do something different. So that piece of narrative is very important for changing the paradigm in our community and our society, but it's also incredibly important for individuals to be able to make changes they want to see in their own lives.
Piper, that's really interesting that you describe it in that way, because it really resonates with me with interactions we've had with the Creative Writing Center here on campus, and Professor Kate Daniels over there really advocates for the narrative process and recovery, and is a poet who writes about substance abuse and alcohol use disorder, and describes the written narrative process in particular as being an important part of this. And so was part of writing that memoir a way in which you work through re-entering, leaving incarceration and re-entering society?
I think it was. It wasn't a process that I thought of. It's not. I wasn't necessarily seeking catharsis, but I found it regardless. I had this very intentional idea about being persuasive and changing people's minds. But, I was also trying to make sense of what I had just experienced and witnessed, what I had gone through, and frankly, more importantly, what I had seen all these other women going through, because most of the women I was incarcerated with had much more difficult lives prior to incarceration, and the impact of incarceration on their lives was also much heavier, because I was not a mother when I was incarcerated. As an example, we know that incarceration of mothers, maternal incarceration, has a devastating effect on children, on families, on communities as a whole. And we know that the communities and families that are most impacted by incarceration are overwhelmingly, Black, Indigenous, people of color. So I did find it cathartic, but I think it's also been incredibly humbling and a gift to be able to work with my incarcerated students, my incarcerated writers. And they are super brave, because some of them have survived unimaginable trauma in their lives, in their childhoods and in their adulthoods. And when you give people a safe place to think about those stories, and when you give people who are criminalized and stigmatized the authorship, the ability sometimes for the first time, to tell the story the way that they see it, instead of having that put on them by a judge or a social worker or some external person who's trying to tell them how they are, it is really transformative and important. It is important for people to be able to tell their story with authenticity and with bravery, and to take ownership of that story, even though it may contain a lot of trauma.
Do you think, and this is kind of for all three of you, because I think you've probably had some similar experiences, but do you think kind of women have a harder time with this and I could think of like a million reasons, research wise, women respond differently to stress, but just thinking about like societal expectations on women as mothers and kind of the pressures that society disproportionately puts on women, do you think this affects their ability, one, to recover, but two, to kind of change the narrative about themselves and their futures that we've been talking about? And it's kind of, maybe we should be giving them support in a different way. If any of you can take that, because you all have that experience.
Yeah, I will definitely say I find myself oftentimes thinking about the patriarchy and the pressure that is on me as a mother and a woman to kind of take care of everybody around me. And, I intentionally think through these things constantly, and have found my voice, right? I ran for election of a state legislature on my story. So I am purposefully using every opportunity I can to illuminate these issues for people who might not have ever experienced incarceration in their family, or know people that have been incarcerated. Most people, though, do know somebody that suffers with substance use disorder. I mean, but the problem is that we don't talk about it enough. We are conditioned in this world to hold these things in silence because there's so much stigma. And so I intentionally, every single day combat this. Right now, I'm suffering with a behavioral health issue in my own family. And, you know, I had to think about that as an elected official. I can tell you that my colleagues definitely are not talking about their personal family behavioral health issues on social media. Well, I do, because I am here to smash all of this stigma and the patriarchy, and also call out, you know, that women should not have to carry so much as far as running your household and taking care of everybody. You know, we need help too. And just being real and authentic, I actually think has been really helpful. I mean, I won my election overwhelmingly, and I have a lot of support in my community and in the state and in the nation. And I think it's because I am really bringing real lived experience to these spaces everywhere. And when I feel afraid, or I feel like, oh, maybe I shouldn't talk about this, then I really take some time and I'm like, no, maybe I really should. Maybe that's why I'm here. And so, yeah, I kind of have a different approach.
Well, I'll tell you, as a maybe not as young as I once used to be woman, one of the biggest things for me is seeing women that are open and saying, I'm not perfect. I think society says you have to be perfect. You have to take care of your family. You have to take care of your children. You need to have a job. You need to be good at your job. And there's like just no room for error. And seeing women stand up there and say, hey, look, I'm not perfect, but that actually makes me even better at my job. And let me tell you how, and let me tell you, I've learned from that experience is incredibly inspiring. And as now a mentor to young graduate students, the thing that I hear the most is that when women are open with these kind of, I don't even want to call them missteps. I think they're just like normal parts of life, that they're like, thank you. I felt this pressure. And now when I see someone that's not perfect, it makes me feel like I can do it even if I'm not perfect. And so just these conversations for addiction, I think are really important, but also just for women seeing that there's like a lot of ways that you can survive in a society that maybe isn't designed for you to thrive, but you find the other women and we help each other, which is nice.
Yes. And I think, Erin, you said some key there is women empowering women. You know, I think about my story alone coming out. I think, again, that's how I survived. I remember going to court and being ordered to court and subpoenaed to court and to what I thought was child support, but they were actually giving me my daughter back without my permission. Okay. I wasn't ready. I was in a transitional house. And, you know, when we hit the shovel and said, I ordered this child back to her mother today, I panicked. One, I wasn't ready. Two, the shame and guilt, you know, the neglect that I put on those kids. But it was the women from that house that supported me and said, we're going to show you how to take care of that baby. We're going to love you and that baby till you can love yourself. And so, you know, I think that's one of the keys is that not only do we empower each other, but not be ashamed of the empowering for one another and where that woman comes from. You know, as single mothers through recovery, it's one of the hardest things. You know, not only do we have to fight the addiction and the mental illness, you know, we become new trophies for the men or any other relationships out there that oftentimes distract us from the goal that sends us back into a dark place. And so I think putting that protective package, which is a care package around women, supporting women, is huge.
Actually, Danny, I'm going to ask you a question now. So I think one of the things that the data shows, and kind of Piper talks a little bit about this earlier, is that women disproportionately kind of undergo like trauma and stress. And so I guess like thinking about, you know, your work on the intersection between stress and drinking and stress and addiction, you know, I guess like what kinds of things like, you know, that are how does that happen? Like, what are these stress intersections? What are you seeing? Do you guys see sex differences in your work and in special ways we should be thinking about this problem?
Yeah, definitely. You know, this was an important mandate that the National Institutes of Health enacted a few years back to encourage scientists to start to include sex as a biological variable as we study brain function. And unsurprisingly, it's revealed that the sex has a major role in driving the way brains and brain circuits work and respond to things like drugs of abuse and alcohol. And we certainly see that in our work and how stress intersects with those aspects of drug and alcohol function. And so it's completely unsurprising, but important as we think about personalized approaches to how we can make changes in how we treat substance use and alcohol use disorders. And Erin, your work has gone to a molecular level in understanding those actual changes that are sex specific.
Yeah, so we have, I'll tell you guys like some science stuff. One of the things we just got accepted for publication. So I'm like really excited. But what we did is we actually had animals, most of the work I do is on cocaine. And what we did is we said, okay, well, how does cocaine change the brain? So we had subjects, I'll say, take cocaine. And then we did profiling, like big data, lots of data, and said what targets in the brain are changed by cocaine. And we did this in males and females. And naively, I thought, oh, well, it'll be different in females, but it'll just be like more or something. And what we found was that even though cocaine was changing the brains in both subjects, it was just completely different molecular targets. And so when you think about drug development and how we focused as a kind of scientific community for many years, overwhelmingly on male subjects, because people thought, well, this is easier. They don't have hormones, which I think is a kind of naive way to look at it. Now we're starting to see that the changes that are happening in women are they're robust. They change behavior, maybe sometimes in similar ways, but the ways that they do that and the targets and the mechanisms are just wildly different, which means that all of these therapies we've developed that are supposed to target, different proteins may only be effective in men. And so, there's this kind of big push now to understand this, and some of the sex differences you see are more complex, and that's true in the psychological aspect as well, of the factors that contribute to why do women take drug in the first place. And it's not always the same reason that men take drugs. And so when you're thinking about treatment and recovery, you have to think about whether the people helping actually understand that, which is, I think, difficult. And I think people
a great case in point is in the alcohol research field, there was a drug development around a specific molecular target that we thought was going to be very useful in treating alcohol use disorder. It was all based on animal model research in male animals, right? And then because of side effects that the drug produced in males, the clinical trials were performed in females and did not produce the results that were expected. But in hindsight, this might not be shocking based on the kinds of things that Erin's describing.
I listen to the biologists and the clinicians talk, and it really makes me reflect on the way that these disparities for women and men inform so many systems that impact people who end up in the criminal legal system. So when I think about the housing system, inadequacies in terms of how we provide for affordable housing, safe and stable housing, which is a fundamental concern for women and girls who end up in the criminal legal system, safe and stable housing. When we think about the healthcare system, when we think about women's access to healthcare and particularly to substance use care, I've been interviewing and talking with, a criminalized Black woman who lives in South Carolina. She's in her late 20s. She's been using drugs for close to a decade. And the question of, what kind of access to care is there for her? And is that care sort of appropriately informed to really be helpful? Is it really going to be the care she needs? Is a big question that runs through her entire story of her entire 20s. And, when I also think about some of the realities which are often misunderstood or ignored entirely about that decade of risk between 15 and 25. I always think of the ages between 15 and 25. That's when I committed my crime that I was eventually incarcerated for many years later. That is the period of time where we see a lot of people get caught up in the system. It's also a period of time of experimentation with things like drugs and alcohol. So sort of a lack of reality, including, sort of ideas about disparities between gender, but also all kinds of different health disparities we know that across the board, when it comes to all kinds of healthcare, that Black women and other BIPOC women are not appropriately, adequately, or fairly served by health systems. So all of those systems start to overlap. And what we see is a lot of neglect of women and girls prior to incarceration. And then we put them into prisons and jails. And I always say that women and girls are probably the single most neglected and sometimes abused people within the criminal legal system, because those systems are overwhelmingly built for men, just like the research that you're describing around addiction and substance use disorder.
Well, and you're talking too about like people of color. One of the interesting biological things, interesting and maybe in a bad way, is that like cigarette additives, for example, are disproportionately increase addiction vulnerability in people of color. And these companies know this. And so, you know, you have these additives and they're regulated in some ways, but when you look at the impact of these flavorants and things like that, they're affecting certain communities. So, you know, it's really crazy, even down to the biology, is that there are vulnerable populations for a number of reasons, whether it's genetics, whether it's the proportion of people in different socioeconomic classes and resources and things like that. And I think we haven't really approached this in a meaningful way yet. I think people are starting to have these conversations, especially with like the legalization of marijuana, and people are starting to realize that maybe some of the drug policies aren't all based on biology, that they're based on political things and how people are trying to oppress others. And so it's kind of exciting to start thinking about how to change the kind of narrative. So along that line, I have a question, kind of maybe Tarra, this would be good for you. Is, you know, when you're thinking about like communicating to people, right? Like Danny and I spend a lot of time talking to scientists, and we speak differently to scientists than maybe my family, who is not they're not scientists. But how do you guys, I guess, like, how do you guys think about of communicating to the public and getting people excited, or not even maybe excited, but kind of in passionate about something? And do you guys have strategies for effective ways to communicate why these things are important and how to kind of break down these barriers?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in my day job, I'm the director and co-founder of a nonprofit organization of, you know, led by and for people that have been incarcerated. And, you know, almost all of us have suffered with substance use disorder. And so really, you know, sharing our stories, sharing the stories of our children and how all of these policies of criminalization have impacted our children. You know, like today, I think one thing people are just, you know, like astonished by is the fact that I am an attorney. I had to fight to the state Supreme Court to become an attorney, and I won, though, in a unanimous same-day decision after the Bar Association denied me. I'm a state representative, but I can't go on a field trip with my kids, right? Because I am, because of punitive policies that keep us out. And so, you know, by sharing our stories, we definitely have made a lot of progress across Washington in the general public's eyes. I will say, you know, talking to lawmakers is sometimes different, and we have to really be strategic on that and, you know, find out who influences each, you know, kind of lawmaker to change policy. But, you know, getting the general public and recognizing that this issue affects all different kinds of families, right? And the more, you know, with the opioid use disorder and the opioid epidemic, and that impacting, you know, families of higher socioeconomic statuses. And, you know, we have continued to move forward and forge new alliances on really getting to undo these harmful policies. But I think it really is about sharing stories and trying to connect with as many people as you can on a human level. And we are finding some success in that.
I know, I guess, Trina, you do a lot of kind of communication with the community and reaching, you know, I guess there's different places to kind of reach, right? You have national things that you want to do, but I think it's maybe just as important and maybe more important. I just spent the last week with my grandparents in Osceola, Missouri, which is a town of like 120 people, and seeing how tight-knit those communities are and how they rely on each other and how they're really successful because this, I guess, how do you look at kind of getting people from the community to kind of invest in your kind of mission? How do you raise money in that realm? How do you kind of explain to them why this is such an important program? And kind of, I guess, maybe what can Danny and I do as scientists to do a better job of talking to our community?
No, I think, excuse me, I had a logic there in my mouth. I apologize. But, I think one of the beauties of the program here locally in Nashville, and why we started from the ground, is that we came over in an urban district. We came over in what most people would call the hood, right? And so we didn't go out and put people out on a farm. My goal is real life recovery. And so I believe that people have to recover in any setting, but what happens when they go back to their community? And so my goal was, let's treat you in your community and show people that we can recover. We're not bad people. We made a couple of bad choices. But if we can recover in our own community will buy into our recovery. And so for us, what we've done is that we've started just from ground zero in this bad neighborhood, and we've turned that neighborhood into a 4-block radius. And we have 110 women up and down 4 blocks of a community, and we've taken these old dilapidated drug houses, right? And every house that we reside in was considered a dope house, right? But we changed the perspective on people's lives. And when I talk to them and they mention dope, right, I get to say, yeah, that is who we were. You know what? It was a dope house, but now it's a hope house. And these women have faith. They believe, the transformation. Like, you don't get to see them on a picture. You get to see them walking up and down the street, getting on the transit, going to work, coming back, applying themselves to their program, picking up litter that someone else has poured into the streets. I mean, they're doing their community service. And so I think from seeing real life situations, the people in the community have bought in. But then when other people ride by, seeing women participate in their own recovery, and they're like, hey, what kind of ministry is that? We get to tell them our own true story. And the women get to speak from their perspective and tell them where they come from. And I don't have to tell their story. They get to tell their own story. And from that along, our state has bought into us. We serve all 90 plus counties. But not only did our state buy in, some of our developers bought in. Some of our legislation bought in. Our council bought in. But that's not enough. It is not enough. And it's people like you, Erin, that we need to, because we don't know it all. All we know is that we need to wake up today and not use, right? That's all we know. Just don't use today. Put the wraparound services in place so that when these women, and one of the things I think that we forget in this behavioral health care is that we think that because we put them in a system of care, that people are going to perfect this thing. We have to be ready. We have to have the pillows stacked for cushion when these women fall. They will fall short. It's guaranteed. Someone in the circle is going to fall short. We're not all going to make it on this first, second round. And so what do we do with that? And so I think we have a failed system is because a woman relapsed, even in my program, right? If she relapsed, Erin, my job is not to discharge her and kick her out. She really has to do something detrimental to get discharged. But if she went to work and got that first paycheck and she didn't make it back home because she was on the bus and somebody offered her a pill and she was tempted and took it, we found out later, we got to figure out what was the trigger. Let's go back and look at the trigger. And from that, we don't kick her or discharge her. We may move her back up in the program and let's revisit those red flags. What happened? And so we support her in strengthening her recovery process. And so I think you and Danny are on to something. And I think that the more you dig in deeper, why we behave like we do, why are we triggered by the man on the bus that told us that we were beautiful, but we're feeling ucky? Why does money trigger us? or make us feel like, and any one of you guys who've used drugs, you know that if you hadn't used drugs in a long time, and if you go pick up a pack of white powder, you know, it's almost like a laxative. You don't even have to put it in your system for it to erupt your stomach, right? But what happens to that woman who gets triggered by something outside of the norm? So there's a lot you guys can do and continue to do. But I'm just grateful that you're doing it. And I'm grateful that you're putting information out here for programs like us. We serve one of the most vulnerable populations. We serve women who are insured, uninsured, whether they have the ability to pay or not. Because I believe, like me, when I came out homeless and indigent and didn't have any family support, you know, the halfway house that I went to, they really didn't want me in that halfway house, right? And I'll say this openly. I was the only Black going into the door. I was fat, looked like I was 6 feet tall, right? And I was gay. And so they didn't think I was appropriate. But like out of that house, I came out, and probably out of 8 people, it was only 2 of us that survived. And so like, I'm grateful I stayed the course, and I was able to face the barriers, right? Because those were barriers for me. I didn't get food stamp assistance because I had 17 felonies. And if you really look at my felonies, like, for real, they gave you a felony for that? Like, those have been riding with me forever. And so I'm just grateful that I was strong enough, and I had 2 or 3 people in the circle to push me and help me press on and get up every day and say, hey, Trina, let's go do this. Let's go do that. And so they walked with me through that process. And I believe that's the only reason for my success, Erin. But, you know, it's people like you guys that are doing the research that help our therapists and our medical providers understand us more. We need that. Some people study us for scientific reasons, and they don't bring it back to the community. I'm grateful, Erin, you guys, Danny, you guys are in our community, you're in our back door, and you're bringing it right back home. That's what we need.
This is important for us as well. You know, we're using models to model kind of what's going on. But the thing is, if we don't talk to the people who we're modeling, our work isn't actually going to reach the communities and have the impact that we want. And so, you know, having these conversations are really important, even for us to think about, how do we conceptualize what addiction is as a disease? Who does it impact? How does it impact them differently? And actually, you know, I think the kind of most defining thing of all 3 of you is that you had these kind of setbacks, you got past them. And instead of just being like, great, I'm safe, all of you went through and said, how can I use my position to change the world for the next people? And I think that is such I want more people to be able to do that, to say, okay, I've made it somewhere. And for me, that's a scientist. Like, what? I never thought I was going to be this. And now you're here and you look back and say, I have no idea how I got here, but I'm here. And how do I use this position to make the world a better place? And, you know, you're learning, and having these conversations gives me ideas for better ways to do that. And so it's just so inspiring that all of you put time into that. That's probably in many cases not rewarded. You know, you do it because you care about other people. And I think that's a big part of the community. How do you help people? You put time that maybe you don't get something back, but you help save someone's life.
Yes. Yeah, I'm really grateful to the 3 of you for being with us here today. I think that your stories and efforts to destigmatize our incarceration and use disorders, you know, I think it's just incredibly important for a variety of reasons. And I think this is something we're continuing to struggle with, is how do we push further in destigmatizing these problems, right? And I think having these sort of frank discussions is one approach to start to do that. But you know, what are other ways that you've thought of to try to, at a broader level in society, destigmatize discussions of these issues that have, you know, persistently been pushed down?
I mean, I think that there has been a significant transformation in the dialogue, the national dialogue over the last particularly 10 to 12 years. I hope that far more people who are affected by, criminalization, affected by substance use disorder are feeling more confident about speaking with authority about their own experiences in the face of stigma, because we know that, that stigma is still a big problem, particularly when it comes to substance use disorder. But in terms of rhetoric, I think that there has been a shift and a change in the way that we think and that we talk about these issues. Where I see less change is around policy. There is some policy change happening, and that's why having Representative Simmons in office is so important, and having, other people, in the policymaking seat who have profound lived experience and a profound commitment to change is so important. But we still see incredibly punitive, even as we see changes in rhetoric and narrative around things like, the opioid and overdose crisis, we still see incredibly punitive policy around, ever higher penalties for certain kinds of drugs, charging people with homicide when they have been involved with an overdose death. These are incredibly punitive approaches. So we have a long way to go and that's not only true when it comes to substance use disorder. We have a long way to go in this country when we think about our incredible attachment to punishment, which has these profoundly deep roots in chattel slavery, in the forced removal of Native peoples. That's how deep our attachment to punishment goes. So, this is work for our lifetimes. It's not work for, the next few years, but it's the most important work, right? To get to a less punitive and a more loving and a more restorative community is well worth the effort. And just this conversation alone shows us how it fingers out into every aspect of our lives. This idea of how can we be more loving, restorative, and less punitive.